There it is.
Hello. Sorry about that. I guess the joys of rural living, my power just went out for a second. Took me a little while for the modem to reboot. Anyways, it's I guess it's a windy day. Anyways, I'll just keep rolling with the presentation. So I'm going to talk to you about what is the Coastal Douglas-fir zone and a little bit about the partnership, and then I have a little bit of information about Sidney Island as well. So let's get into it. So one of the let's see if we can do this. There we go. So something that Andy is infinitely more familiar with than I am.
Darryn,
Yes.
sorry, hate to interrupt. I think you may need to reshare your screen if you're speaking to your slides now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How's that?
Excellent.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I was saying was something that Andy is definitely infinitely more familiar with than I am is in BC, we have this wonderful ecosystem classification system called the Biogeochromatic Ecosystem Classification System. And it was invented in BC, and it's a sort of hierarchical system of classifying ecosystems. And at the broadest level, we have what are known as zones. And there's 16 different BEC zones mapped in BC. And one of them is called the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, and it is the smallest of all the BEC zones, and represents only a small percentage, 0.3% of the total land in BC, and contains a unique set of ecosystems that occur along, the southeast side of Vancouver Island, across the Gulf Islands, and the southwest coast of the lower mainland. The island's trust area in the Gulf Islands is entirely within the CDF zone. The CDFCP is a conservation partnership, and it's intended to be a forum for collaboration and communication about coastal Douglas-fir and associated ecosystems. It was formed somewhat organically after a series of workshops a number of years ago, attended by a variety of folks, including representatives from various levels of government and natural resource professionals, as well as environmental organizations. And it was formed in 2013. We've been rolling sort of ever since, and we're trying to strategically address threats to these ecosystems and help folks raise awareness of these globally imperiled ecosystems and provide and foster conservation and stewardship as well. So the map shows the area within which the CDFCP operates. The dark green is actually the CDF zone itself, but the boundary of the partnership extends to the next into the next BEC zone, the coastal western hemlock, and this was because of the transitional area between these two zones, and they face similar threats and stewardship issues, and also to account for anticipated changes in the boundaries because of climate change and things like that. So yeah, the focus is on the CDF that the partnership has, but it's also why we refer to the associated ecosystems as well. So just a slightly more close version of this, typically there's an elevational cutoff. So it's mostly below 150 meters in elevation in the CDF zone. In a couple of areas, it's actually extended farther up the slope. It's also where, 75% of BC's population is. So we'll talk about what that means in terms of what's happened to the zone over time. So the CDF zone is it's the mildest climate in Canada, and so it's characterized by mild and moist winters and warm and dry summers. So it's a Mediterranean like climate. We're sitting in the rain shadow of the mountains on Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula, and it's has fostered and allowed a rich, flora and fauna to thrive here. It's, the Coastal Douglas-fir zone is named, after the iconic Douglas fir tree, but these ecosystems include a lot more than just a forest with Douglas fir trees. Contain a wide variety of ecosystems, including, Garry oak ecosystems and wetlands and, shorelines and things like that. 90% of the ecosystems described really in the CDF and are forested and woodland ecosystems, but there's also, wetland and riparian ecosystems, freshwater marshes and saltgrass estuaries, and herbaceous ecosystems like our, sand dune ecosystems and, pocket grasslands as well. The forests in the CDF, again, are typically found, below 150 meters in elevation, contain, multiple species. They're primarily regenerating forests, and we'll talk about that. The majority of the CDF has been logged, and there's a very little old growth remaining in the zone. The drought in the summer has an influence on the climax ecosystems, and I'm sure Andy's going to get into what climate change is doing to this zone. But also, some of the arbutus trees are and shore pine we see on some of our drier sort of nutrient poor sites. Garry oak trees and western flowering dogwood are some of the other prominent trees in these forests. This ecosystems in the CDF are rare, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and how we describe them. So there's 48 ecological communities described in the CDF zone, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But they're essentially biodiversity elements that it's the unit of classification, and you can assess their conservation status just like we do species. And so the CDF conservation status can be assessed at different scales, provincially, nationally, and globally. And many of the ecological communities are assessed globally as being either critically imperiled or imperiled. So these are unique ecosystems that aren't really found anywhere else. So BC has the global responsibility for these things too. And a lot of people, I don't think, recognize just how special and unique these ecosystems are. So again, ecological communities, this is an internationally sort of recognized way of describing ecosystems. It's the term and the unit used by NatureServe and the Ministry of Environment's Conservation Data Center to describe the ecosystems that are then also assessed for their conservation status. There's over 650 described currently in BC, and the majority of them have had their conservation status assessed. Again, some at the global scale. There's four main types of or functional sort of groups of ecological communities, and so you can kind of think about them as the matrix forest ecosystems, and then small patch, large patch ecosystems, and then linear ecosystems like the riparian ecosystems. So the interesting part about the CDF is that the majority of the zone has been mapped has terrestrial ecosystem mapping, and that allows for essentially the opportunity to sort of create comprehensive element occurrence mapping for these ecological communities. So in the CDF zone, the matrix forest ecosystem has been mapped across the zone, and so these element occurrences have been spatially identified and mapped by the Conservation Data Center, and then each one has undergone an ecological integrity assessment, and essentially you're ranking for each of these areas the ecological integrity based on assessments of the condition of that area, the landscape context, and the size. And this has been rolled up into an ecosystem status report, which is published by our friends at Ministry of Environment Conservation Data Center. It's interesting to note that despite having 600 plus ecological communities described, there's only last time I checked status reports. So everyone's quite familiar with the concept and the idea around species at risk, but I feel like there's less known about sort of this idea of ecological communities and the fact that you can treat these as, you know, elements of biodiversity. So characteristics of the CDF zone, and one of the reasons why we're in a situation where there's, you know, a lot of value, but there's also been a lot of impacts. And, you know, having 75% of the population in BC, the result is that, you know, basically half the zone has been altered, and a combination of basically human disturbance. And that's like permanent conversion, basically. There's very, relatively speaking, low levels of protection across the zone. I think this number is a little outdated, and we might be at, you know, 10% or something now, but it's relatively low in terms of the levels of protection across the zone. And even where that protection is located is also varies in terms of the ecosystems that are protected in that network of reserves, as well as the locations. For example, the Gulf Islands has a higher level of protection than, say, the Nanaimo area lowlands or something. So the interesting part about the CDF2, again, it's speaking to its high biodiversity values, is it's the smallest zone, but it also has the highest number of at-risk species of any biogeochromatic zone in BC. There's greater than 200 species that are provincially listed as either threatened or endangered. 25 species are globally imperiled, and a large number of federally listed species at risk as well. So again, you know, high biodiversity values compared to anywhere else in BC. Again, just stating that there's, you know, some of the challenges with having 3/4 of the population of BC living in this zone. Threats. So what happened? I mean, obviously there's you know, permanent conversion due to urban and suburban settings and agricultural uses, logging, and when they completed the ecosystem mapping across the zone, less than 1% of the old growth in the CDF remains. So it's why the vast majority of these forests are regenerating second growth forests where they still are. Again, some of these threats are potentially recoverable. For example, the element occurrence mapping, and obviously for the matrix forest ecosystem, includes a lot of areas of young and mature forest. So forest harvesting, some of the agriculture, recreation, those are potentially recoverable, and our forest ecosystems are somewhat resilient to that. And some, on the other hand, are irreversible. I mean, this is the type of, you know, landscape change that is a permanent conversion. So we know what some of those areas look like in terms of, you know, downtown Victoria or something. Why does it matter? So again, the summary, this has, you know, the zone has some of the highest number of species at risk and ecosystems at risk in BC. It's globally unique. It's almost entirely located in BC, other than some occurrences of these ecosystems in the San Juan Islands. It's the most threatened biogeochromatic zone, essentially, in the province. Less than 1% old growth remaining. Half of it's been permanently altered. Only 9% is protected. And the other challenge is that it has a high proportion of private land relative to the rest of BC. 80% of the land in the CDF is private land. Only 9% of it is provincial crown land, and then 11% is owned by the other levels of government. So this is a unique land ownership pattern that also presents a real challenge to meet, you know, biodiversity conservation and stewardship objectives across the zone. So again, it's the most threatened zone in BC. This statement kind of summarizes it. It comes from a report by Rachel Holt back in 2007, where the extent of disturbance combined with the low level of protection places the ecological integrity of the CDF zone at high risk. Now, I have never been to Sydney Island, I will admit that, so I don't know much about it, but I thought I would query a couple, some pieces of information and just talk about that. So again, going to the Conservation Data Center, we can bring up some element occurrences on Sidney Island, and there's a lot. There's several examples of red-listed plants on the island. There's red-listed animals, and there's the ecological communities, again, are mapped on across Sidney Island as well. Another method of ecosystem inventory or mapping is the sensitive ecosystem inventory mapping, and again, there's many polygons located on Sidney Island. And not only are there high biodiversity values in the CDF, but there's high biodiversity values on this island as well. And that's resulted, when I looked at some of the conservation planning that's been done in the basin, you know, the area on Sidney Island, for example, in the Islands Trust Conservancy's regional conservation plan has been, the majority of it is identified as having high relative values for conservation and stewardship. The southern part of the island was identified by the Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team as a priority site across the range of Garry Oak ecosystems, and it was also then identified in the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Salish Sea Natural Areas Conservation Plan as a priority 1 area for land securement and stewardship activities. So again, that's all of the presentation today. Close out with the logo of the CDFCP and our website. Feel free to visit there. There's lots of information about CDF ecosystems, and we're a very inclusive partnership. Anyone can join us. You can sign a statement of cooperation you can find on the website and sign up. We've got an active coordinator right now, so we're trying to communicate to our members on a regular basis, and we've got a lot of interesting projects going on right now with a real focus on local governments, again trying to deal with the private land issue and knowing that local governments can have an influence on that land base. Thanks for your time. Do we want to open the floor for a few questions, if there are any?
If there is any question, Darryn, I had to laugh when you said Mediterranean climate. I think I grew up in a Mediterranean climate, and sometimes I struggle here with the climate.
I got you.
But if
a cool Mediterranean climate, I guess.
Yes, a northern Mediterranean climate. And I don't know if there are any questions that the public wants to provide to Darryn, or if you want to move on and ask, and hear Andy too. Like, I don't see any raised hand or question right now, and Stephanie is also saying no. We have a shy group, I guess. So Andy, since they want going to talk.
Hello.
About...
Wait, we do have Tiffany has a.
Oh yes, Tiffany. I now.
Hi, I was just wanting to inquire or just kind of plant a seed that I'm interested because I've just started doing GIS mapping for the Saanich Leadership Council, and I was just trying to map the bioregional zones within our territory. Of course, our territory is both on the Canada and the US side, so having a fluid connection between the zones that Washington mapped and BC mapped, they don't quite align. So I was just wondering if you are familiar with anyone, or if you yourself has worked with anyone, being able to have a more intact mapping that goes fluidly from BC to Washington.
I bet you Andy can answer this better than I can, but I know that there was an initiative called the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and it did fund some cross-border conservation planning outside of BC and into you know, the larger sort of Puget Sound ecosystem, and I think that's one of the things that they had to tackle was the difference in the ecosystem mapping on either side of the border. But I believe there were some crosswalking, so to speak, in order to have some consistency in the planning. Andy, do you have anything?
Sure, yeah, there definitely has been quite a lot of cross-border work of late. The units, the biogeoclimatic units that Darryn was showing aren't used in Washington State. But the Conservation Data Center here in British Columbia, which is our NatureServe office, has been working in conjunction with NatureServe offices in Washington and Oregon, starting with their plot data on both sides of the border and building up classifications so that they can rank plant communities and ecosystem types internationally as well as just provincially. And the best person to talk to about that as a starting point is the plant ecologist at BC's Conservation Data Center, Jennifer Penny. And if you, so if you just go to the Conservation Data Center, it should be easy enough to find Jennifer's contact info. And if you can't find it, then please follow up with me.
Thank you so much. I'll look up Jennifer Penny and NatureServe. And what was the last one?
The Conservation Data Center. So here in BC, there are NatureServe offices all around North America and beyond. And in BC, we call our NatureServe office the Conservation Data Center. It's within BC's Ministry of Environment.
Thank you very much, Andy. I don't see any further questions for Darryn, so I think he may have ducked out. No, there he is. Thank you so much, Darryn.
I'm going to deke out now, though. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the presentation, and good luck with the rest of your speaker series.
Thank you, and thank you for participating. We appreciate a lot your time and the sharing of your incredible knowledge. Have a great Friday, and we hope to see you soon again.
Thank you. I'm off to work on mountain goats. So.
Thanks, Darryn. Good seeing you again.
Yeah, you too, Andy. Bye-bye.
And so now we have our second speaker for our speaker series, Andy. And I saw in the chat box that they were asking if you, Andy, would touch on climate change. And from what I have knowledge of, yes. So we are all listening to your presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It was good to look at the species at risk on Sidney Island and see that most of the plant species at risk are associated with the spit, with the sand dunes and the works that Parks Canada and others are doing there, because we're doing some dune restoration work here in Metchosin, working with Pippi Lawn and others, and with a lot of the same species that have been identified as at risk on the spit. So that was fun to see. My name is Andy MacKinnon. I'm a forest ecologist. I haven't brought a picture show, so I am going to speak for only 5 to 10 minutes, I hope, unless I get severely distracted, and hopefully leave lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards. I've been involved, as Darryn mentioned, for a long time in ecosystem classification and mapping, forest ecology research, and working with climate modelers on the impacts or potential impacts, projected impacts of changing climate on ecosystems and species. And Bea asked me to talk about, forest resiliency, the importance of biodiversity and climate change, and everything else, especially in relation to Sidney Island. And so those are my topics for today, of course, because Bea asked. So climate change, I see a question in the chat box from Virginia about climate change. I think one of the most important things to recognize about climate change is that it's been underway for a long time. It's not projections about things that might be happening. Here in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, our mean annual temperature is about 1 degree warmer than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So climate change has been underway for quite a while. Projections, climate change projections for the Coastal Douglas-fir zone and southeastern Vancouver Island in general are projections both of temperature and precipitation. With the projections about temperature, the modelers have a lot more certainty about than projections about precipitation, simply because of the number of factors controlling them. Temperature projections are that the temperatures will continue to increase and that might accelerate. This is a real problem in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, which has one of the mildest climates in Canada and is incredibly dry over the entire zone, and especially in some areas in the southern Gulf Islands and the southern parts of the Saanich Peninsula. The observatory at Victoria at Gonzales Hill oftentimes comes in about 750 millimeters of total annual precipitation in a year. That is dry enough that we have scattered occurrences, but we certainly have occurrences of cactus and other succulents in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone. So when people think about the coast of British Columbia, they don't usually think of a climate where cactus would grow. But it's a very dry climate, and if it's going to get warmer and drier, then we're going to begin to lose the capability to support some of the species here. So it has become warmer. Most projections suggest that mean annual precipitation, or the average amount of precipitation that falls over the course of a year, might very well remain about the same, but the seasonality will shift, so that we should get a lot more precipitation falling in the wintertime, and in some projections, a lot less in the summertime, leading to increased summertime droughts. We've certainly seen that over the last couple of decades with associated tree death, which I'll get to in a second. And the increased precipitation in the wintertime, most projections suggest, will come in a smaller number of more intense rainfall events. All right. So not just more precipitation in the wintertime, but probably delivered in more severe, smaller number of more severe storms. So what do these projected changes in climate mean? First of all, an increased wildfire threat. And I say threat, but we have seen the worst wildfire years in British Columbia on record over the last few years. Of course, that extends to California, Oregon, and Washington as well. So we are seeing not just increased wildfire threat, much drier forests by all of the measures of dryness that they use, but also increased wildfire. Increased summertime drought. And one of the things that we have seen within the Coastal Douglas-fir zone is widespread mortality of Western red cedar. And this has been going on for about 15 years. And I think anybody who's watching trees around southeastern Vancouver Island, the southern Gulf Islands, has seen a lot of dead cedar trees around. So we've lost a lot of Western red cedar, and we'll likely continue to lose quite a bit more. It's entirely possible if the summertime droughts increase, as some projections suggest, we might lose Western red cedar in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone. And of course, that has not only ecological effects, economic effects, but important cultural effects as well, right? There is projected to be an increase in storm intensity in wintertime, which could, and perhaps already is, leading to increased slope instability and changes in the timing and volumes of water that's delivered in river systems. And that has implications for riparian communities and fish populations. it's suggested that we're likely to see an increase in incidence and severity of some forest pathogens like insects and disease. There were a number of factors associated with the outbreak of mountain pine beetle in British Columbia a decade ago now that killed 10 million hectares of forest in the interior of British Columbia. But certainly one of them was a changing climate. It had been a long, long time since there had been any cold winters that are the things that usually limit populations of mountain pine beetle in interior British Columbia. So that was certainly a contributor. But in general, as temperatures warm, we should see increased growth and severity in the attacks of a lot of insect and fungal species. And so if we're talking about insects and disease that affect mortality of tree species, we anticipate seeing more of that in the future. The Forest Insect and Disease Survey people are also keeping an eye out because as our climate warms, it becomes more amenable for some insect and disease species or insect and fungal species that we know from Washington State but haven't recorded in British Columbia yet. So we're expecting that as the climate in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, the climate on Sidney Island becomes warmer, it will become a better habitat for a lot of species that we know from south of us, but don't necessarily know from British Columbia. Some of those will be insect and disease organisms. And then if there's one thing I think we should remember about climate change, it's that it's going to, some of the things that are going to result from climate change are going to be between difficult and impossible to predict. So there will be lots of surprises. One that comes to mind is I worked with a number of scientists from Southeast Alaska and on Haida Gwaii on a disease called yellow cedar decline. Well, not a disease, but widespread mortality of yellow cedar on the north coast, right down to about the Gwaii River in the central coast of British Columbia and on Haida Gwaii, where yellow cedar grows at elevation, and a warming climate has led to widespread mortality of yellow cedar, tens of thousands of hectares of dead yellow cedar as a result of root freezing. So you go, huh, warmer climate leading to widespread death from root freezing. And that's because yellow cedar is a shallow rooted species that usually, that grows at elevation along the central and north coast and on Haida Gwaii. It doesn't grow on sea level except in a boggish type ecosystem. For the most part, it's a subalpine species where it relies on snow cover in the wintertime to protect its roots, which are near the surface of the soil. It's a shallow rooted species. A warming climate has reduced snowpack in a lot of areas, leading to death of these shallow roots from freezing because they don't have their snowpack anymore. So a warming climate leading to increased freezing of roots. Nobody could have predicted that. It took about 5 years to figure out why all these yellow cedars were dying. A little closer to home, one that might work better on Sidney Island or in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone is about 5 or 6 years ago, we were losing an awful lot of arbutus trees to leaf blight. Well, actually up to a decade ago now. And the leaves would turn black and fall off and the trees would die. And so people thought, well, I wonder if we have an introduced new pathogen. And a lot of work was put into trying to identify which fungal species were causing this leaf blight, causing the tree to lose its leaves. Turns out most of them are species that have always been leaf blight pathogens of arbutus. And probably the best explanation, as far as I'm concerned, is that the arbutus trees have these leaf blights that they have evolved to live with probably over millennia. But now these arbutus trees are being increasingly stressed by summertime drought, especially the more shallow rooted arbutus trees. and blights the fungal pathogens that might have partially defoliated them or defoliated them for 1 year are now able to defoliate them for a few years in a row and kill them. And again, it's not something people predicted or projected from climate change. So I think there's going to be a lot of surprises out there, things we didn't expect, things that are counterintuitive. So given that we're uncertain about the nature of climate change and uncertain about what effects we might see from climate change, how to proceed in general and on Sidney Island. I think probably the first thing, well, I was thinking about this and I thought in terms of a workshop that I hosted a few years ago where we were talking about differences between old growth and second growth forests, and we were thinking about it in terms of structure, composition, and processes. So if we're trying to maintain a healthy forest with the assumption that a healthy forest will be a forest that's more resilient to the changes that are taking place, how can we go about doing that? And I think in terms, again, of composition, structure, and processes. Now, processes, I won't deal much with that. It's not something we can manage for very effectively, but we can manage for species composition and structure. Species composition, the recommendation of most resource managers in most ecosystems is that your best hedge against the uncertainty of a changing climate and its uncertain effects is to try and maintain all of the species that you would expect in a particular ecosystem. This is difficult because for for all ecosystems in British Columbia, we don't know the majority of the species that live there. Okay, probably the majority of the species on Sidney Island are microbes, they're viruses, they're microfungi, and then we know something about the vascular and non-vascular plants and vertebrate animals, at least, that live there. But probably 90% of the species on Sidney Island, we don't know what they are, we don't know their names, we don't know how much there is. But we can manage for the ones that we know. Keeping all the species on the island, of course, means retaining a healthy understory. This is one of the big challenges on Sidney Island, of course, with the deer populations, with the blacktail and the fallow deer. If you want to maintain an appropriate species composition on the island, you're either going to have to fence the whole island or undertake some kind of deer control. You know that. But that's part of trying to keep all of the species there that are there. For structure, and this is a really interesting area and an area that a lot of people have been working on, is structure is oftentimes described in terms of horizontal and vertical structure. Vertical structure, the fancy forest ecologists talk in terms of horizontal and vertical heterogeneity. And what they're actually talking about, some fairly simple concepts in terms of a vertical structure, something as simple as the number of stems per hectare and the composition of those forest types. And there is some information available about structure of relatively undisturbed ecosystems in the Coastal Douglas-fir. And so we know, for example, that a lot of relatively undisturbed old growth forests in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone might have between 300 and 400 stems per hectare. And we know that a lot of the second growth forests will have 1,000 or 1,500 stems per hectare. So one of the things that can be done is to begin to reduce the number of stems per hectare to something that is more along the lines of an undisturbed stand. This will have a few effects. One, by reducing the number of trees that are there, you reduce the composition for resources. So if we are seeing some real problems from a summertime drought, if you have fewer trees there, each tree should have access to a bit more moisture. That's one. The second is the trees should be able to grow larger, faster. You should allow more light down to the understory, which should help in the development of understory vegetation. And perhaps most importantly for Sidney Island, you reduce wildfire risk with a smaller number of stems. So you can begin to look at the structure of the stand, and over a lot of the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, I haven't done stems per hectare measurements on Sidney Island. It's worth looking at it. The stems per hectare is sometimes 3 or 4 times what we see in relatively natural stands. That's not unique to the CDF, but it's something that's amenable to local work and something we can deal with. In terms of horizontal structure, a lot of that has to do with what people call coarse woody debris or logs on the ground. These are important habitat for a lot of fungi and lichens. So one of the reasons in some Scandinavian countries, more than half of the threatened and endangered species are species that rely on large pieces of wood standing or on the ground as habitat, because a lot of the wood on the forest floor has been removed. So it's important, if you want to maintain all the species, to keep wood on the forest floor and to think very carefully about what you're doing, because if you leave too much wood on the forest floor, you can very quickly overrule or overturn any wildfire risk advantages you might have gained by thinning and spacing the trees. But the wildfire people tell us that the wildfire risk is increased by having a lot of smaller pieces of wood on the ground, and that it's entirely possible to maintain larger pieces of wood on the ground as part of the stand structure that we ought to be managing for. That's something that we see in the CDF and the CWH XM1, the unit next to it that Darryn was talking about there. In this part of the world, over a lot of the South Island, are black bears den in the bases of trees, but also in big pieces of coarse woody debris or logs on the ground. And over a lot of southern Vancouver Island, those large pieces on the ground have either been removed or have rotted back into the soil. And so they've resorted in some areas to trying to kit out culverts as bear habitats, which is as abysmal a sign of resource management failure as I'm familiar with. So either we need to find a way to leave more big pieces of wood on the ground, or we need to breed smaller bears. Okay, so just a few suggestions about how we might manage for species and structure. For species, for the understory, of course, controlled deer browse, and for some other species that are characteristic of older stands in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone that there will be absent or in small numbers on a place like Sidney Island, we simply require time. So there's, for example, a group of lichens that have fungi and algae involved with them, but also oftentimes have cyanobacteria as a partner in the partnership that we refer to as cyanolichens, that can actually fix nitrogen from the air and can be relatively significant contributors to the nitrogen economy of these nitrogen limited ecosystems that we never ever find in younger second growth stands. They seem to require time. So letting some trees grow old will allow you to capture things like cyanolichens. Try and if you have the opportunity, use reference data to try and look at what sort of stand manipulation might be possible. And in forests like Sidney Island, the same sorts of things that you would do to try and restore composition and species to the stands also reduce wildfire risk, which are two things that everybody is trying to deal with in terms of climate change. So that doesn't work everywhere in BC, but in these sorts of ecosystems, of second growth ecosystems, you can address multiple goals. And the final thing I'll mention, so that we have time for discussions and questions, is I think it's really important to have some kind of monitoring protocol so that if there are changes taking place, you'll notice them. For example, I was over last autumn on Pender Island, where they're concerned about Douglas fir mortality. They think more Douglas fir trees are dying than had been dying in the past. But there's really no way of telling because nobody is monitoring the rate of mortality of Douglas fir. Similar on Sidney Island. You could have increased mortality of Douglas fir, and you might look around and see a few dead Douglas fir around, but there's really no way of telling whether we're seeing increased mortality of Douglas fir because we don't have any baseline data for what mortality was like last year or 10 years ago. So I think monitoring is kind of critically important. For example, also, there are lots, the government's really big on operational programs, and oftentimes doesn't want to invest money in monitoring because I don't have to tell you guys this, but at the very worst, at the very best, monitoring will show that your management activities are doing what they're supposed to do. And at their worst, they'll show that they're not. And why would a government ever want to spend money on that? In order to demonstrate that the rest of the money they'd spent had been wasted, right? I worked on Haida Gwaii a lot with people who do stream restoration and try and build structure back into streams after they've been logged and the in-stream structure has all been destroyed. And they generally say, well, you know, we used to think that pulling wood out of these streams was a really good thing to let the fish go by. And so we spent a lot of money pulling wood out of the streams in the 1940s and 1950s. And then we figured out that the fish didn't like that because they didn't have their pools and riffles anymore. So now we're smarter and we're putting a lot more wood back into the stream. And boy, through the 90s and the aught years, the government was spending hundreds of millions of dollars each year trying to build structure back into these streams. And I said, okay, and how well is that working? There's so very little work being done on monitoring the effects of our management actions that if people are going to become involved in thinning and spacing and deer reduction or deer exclusion or something like that, please set some kind of monitoring system in place so that after a year or 5 years and 10 years, you have some idea whether it's done any good at all. If you don't set those monitoring systems in place, and most people don't, you'll never know. So happy to stick around and have discussion and questions and things like that. I see we've got some in the chat already. Do you want me to start with those, Stephanie, or how would you like to proceed? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a question, but Ken, under his wife's name, Valentina, was mentioning that they do on Sidney Island know the stem count per hectare.
Oh, good. And have been thinning and spacing. Excellent. Good. Thank you very much, Valentina, or Ken impersonating Valentina, whoever it is that's put that in there. That's great. Do you have some kind of monitoring protocol in place to look at things like responsive vegetation to your thinning efforts?
Yes, we do. We have had for more than a decade.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, pardon me for bringing that up then.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can. Pardon me for bringing that up. You're doing much better than most other places with operational thinning and spacing programs in the province. That's terrific. Really glad to hear that.
I see also Tiffany. I will ask you to unmute here.
Hi, I was just wondering, well, I just want to say thank you for your presentation. Sidney Island is known by many names like Skthaman and Khalamasung and Huyamachin. And so I'm grateful for sharing your words here today. But I was just curious, have you seen, am I frozen?
No, we can hear
Oh,
you.
okay. Valentina's voice kind of popped on the screen. Have you, there are some plans in our territories to bring back burns for the meadows, but I was just curious if you've seen any other communities bringing back controlled burns in the forests, and if you have noticed, or if they have noticed, you know, those species, those microorganisms and those fungi that you were talking about in terms of species, like, does that have an impact on the diversity and numbers of those species if people reintroduce controlled burns into the forest management?
Yes, absolutely. The best experimental evidence that I've seen is at the in the Coastal Douglas-fir zone, at least, is at the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Garry Oak Preserve in Maple Bay near Quamachin Lake, where they have been burning and monitoring the response of vegetation species to burn treatments for quite a while. There's quite a lot of information about how that prepares the ground for a number of the species they're trying to manage for there, including a number of the species I think you'd be interested in, Tiffany, a lot of important food plants like common camas, great camas, chocolate lilies, and others. The other thing that comes to mind is simply the mapping that Anna, student at UBC, I can dig it up, did in gathering the 1850s mapping from around southern Vancouver Island, which was a really interesting study. So I live in Metchosin, and I have the maps for the Metchosin area. I think they were from 1854. And it's really interesting because they show a lot of areas as either open grasslands, or as it's mapped as deciduous forest, but we know it was oak forest, Garry Oak Forest, that are now either coniferous forest or some of them, of course, have been modified for agriculture. But on those deep soil sites that the Garry Oak species and the classic Garry Oak meadows were only maintained through indigenous burning. And a number of those species have now disappeared from those sites simply because of the cessation of the burning at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's great to see people experimenting with the reintroduction of the burning, and it will increase species diversity, and is a fascinating area of research and management.
Yes, wait,
Yeah, I was just,
okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it'd be interesting speaking kind of to folks from SIERP, if we are able to also get an inventory and monitoring of, if possible, of the fungi and the viruses and things like that that exist before we do our first burn on the islands. That's all.
Fungi would be relatively tractable. I suspect viruses next to impossible, even if there was somebody around who was working with them. But we are actually doing an inventory of the mycorrhizal species associated with the roots of Garry Oak in British Columbia right now, and it's fascinating. Among others, in some of the groups, at least, most of the species have no matching genetic signatures anywhere in the published literature. So there appear to be a whole bunch of new to science species growing with the roots of Garry Oak in British Columbia. And that's one of those things, for example, that there used to be an awful lot more oak on the landscape in the 19th century and before than there is today. And when you lose the oak, you lose a lot of things that are associated with the oak. So when you bring back the oak, be interesting to see, as you say, Tiffany, it'd be interesting to monitor what species come back with it.
Yes, I was reading the chat box, which Judith, we may connect for more information. Yes, she is. Okay, Judith is connecting for more information with you, Andy, about all this key information that you're providing. Is there anyone who would like to be unmuted, has a question either in the chat box, or Tiffany, for example, showed herself with a hand, but you have also your little hand on your Zoom bar that you can click on if you wish.
I'm good for about 5 more minutes, Bea, and I gotta head off.
I know, I feel grateful that you gave us so much time and that I was able to steal you. So take advantage of this incredible person. If you have a burning question, we still have 5 minutes. Look how old he is.
Yeah.
Judith, I think you should be unmuted. You can ask your question.
Should be unmuted. Hi, Andy. Good to see you. I didn't want to kind of jump in. I wanted to leave time for everybody else to ask questions. But I had questions around the invasive species, which is kind of another piece of what our group is looking at. And we focus in particular on hawthorn because it's a little bit more manageable than getting into something like, oh, the oh so lovely broom. And I just wondered if you had any comments, wisdom, suggestions on the removal of invasives as part of the, and I'm not talking about the deer in this moment, the invasive plants in relation to restoring a healthy forest ecosystem.
Just that you ought to. When I talked about people keeping an eye out for new insect and fungal pathogens of trees, I didn't mention that the Invasive Species Council of British Columbia and local groups are also keeping an eye out for new invasive species, and especially species from further south. As our climate warms, we're going to become much more amenable to new invasive species that we might not have seen in British Columbia before. And we are seeing on southern Vancouver Island some new invasive plant species. It's something to keep an eye on. I think you need to pick your battles with invasive species, at least we do in our parts of the world. And you need to pick not just with species, but with where you're trying to control them as well. And there are some invasive species that I think we're never going to be able to control. There are, of course, groups like the CRISP, the Capital Region Invasive Species Partnership, and others have a classification for invasive species, ranging from those that are recently introduced and considered really dangerous, that are highest priority, to those that have been here for 100 years and are going to be with us. Well, there will be ivy growing on my grave, despite my best efforts to control this species. And also look not just at how difficult they are to control, but what kind of an impact they're having too. Are they displacing native vegetation? Are they affecting soil chemistry? So a lot of the interesting effects people are finding from Scotch broom are not necessarily from displacing native vegetation, but Scotch broom, because it's a legume, because it's a nitrogen fixer, seems to be particularly good at making areas that it grows more habitable for Scotch broom and less habitable for some other plant species through nitrification of the soil, but also through allelopathic chemicals. If hawthorn is your problem, that's great that you can go after it. And as you say, it's probably tractable and probably controllable. So it's probably a good species to target, but there are going to be species that will always be on Sidney Island, and there are going to be species that will probably always be on Sidney Island and probably not affect the native vegetation all that much. So I really think you got to pick your battles, but you know that.
Thank you so much, Andy. I think we are going to let you flee for now, but I am always happy, or Bea is always happy. Anyone who perhaps had questions that they were too shy to ask or that come up at a later point, we're happy to take questions, and then we may pester poor Andy with them. In the future.
Absolutely. I would appreciate that. Thanks so much.
Of course, Bea, I'll let you close us out.
Yes, and just to let you know, we will post the recording on our shared Dropbox, and we invite you to share it with other people. And if those other people have questions, invite them to connect with us, and we will be able to connect them with our speakers. Today was our first day, and we are really happy to have you seen all here and are excited about the coming speaker series, which you will have. We will send now reminders every week. So we will pester you every week to remind you that we are here with amazing speakers, and are looking forward to hear feedback. And maybe there are some topics you really want to hear about and we have not thought about, or we haven't heard about, which we will also be super happy to present. So thank you for today's time you have offered us. Maybe Stephanie, we want to unmute everyone to say just goodbye, and if there is some burning question before we go away, and then we hope to see you again next Friday.
I was going to unmute, but I actually can't find the unmute all button, so I'm going to assume everyone is saying farewell. If anyone has any questions about the series or anything and wants to stick around, feel free to stick around, and Bea and I will be here for a couple of minutes. Sorry, but otherwise, we will see you again, same time, same place, Fridays at noon next week.
And thank you for coming.